In our Plant Conversation series, the garden's leadership engages in casual conversations with fascinating plant science researchers. In the upcoming programs of this series, we are excited to showcase agricultural science, which connects to our current exhibit, Cultivate, Growing Food in a Changing World. Our collections at the garden include hundreds of agricultural and economically important plants, including one of our featured plants today, the mango tree. We have 4 different types of mangoes or cultivars, one of which can be found in our conservatory at the garden court, and the rest are grown in our production facility. We grow these particular cultivars because we have successfully gotten them to fruit inside our greenhouses, which can be tricky. Our cultivars include Edward, Floragon, Hayden, and Malacca. And here you can see a photo of the Edward mangoes in fluorescence and the individual flowers. And here's a look at the unripe fruit in our production facility. Today, Dr. Emily Warschefsky will be in conversation with our acting executive director, Dr. Susan Pell, to discuss her fascinating research. Dr. Warschefsky is an associate scientist and the Alice Brown Curator at the William L. Brown Center for Ethnobotany at the Missouri Botanic Garden. Her research is focused on crop evolution and domestication, with an emphasis on woody perennial species and the conservation and use of crop wild relatives. Botanist, educator, and acting executive director of the USBG, Dr. Susan Pell has traveled the world collecting plants for scientific study. Using her expertise, Susan shows people the awesomeness of plants every day. Welcome, Dr. Warschefsky and Dr. Pell.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that introduction. And thank you, Emily, for joining us today. And I'm excited to nerd out with you about mangoes and sunflowers and all kinds of other things. But I'm wondering if you can kind of start us off by giving us a little bit of an introduction about how you, as a plant scientist, work in agriculture.
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited to be here to chat with you, Susan. So my work, I come from an area where I'm just interested in understanding plant diversity and how all of the plants that we see around us kind of came to be. So that's plant evolutionary biology. And I ended up focusing on an agricultural species, mango, for my research when I was doing my PhD. And that kind of opened this door to thinking about how evolution works when we're domesticating crops, and especially when we're talking about different kinds of crop species. Because, we have a huge variety of different crops available to us that we get all sorts of wonderful products from. And it's just really interesting to think about how those are different and the different ways that we use them and cultivate them.
I'm wondering if Grace can go ahead and pull up that kind of crop diversity photo or slide that you prepared for this presentation, and we can talk a little bit about some of that diversity.
Yeah, so this is just a snippet of crop diversity, is showing you kind of the range of different things that we can get from the crops we eat. It's much more than what we think of, especially in the United States. We think of agriculture and we think about cornfields and fields of wheat. But we also have, everything from bananas and blueberries to sunflower seeds, and then things like coffee and tea and spices and chocolate. So kind of some of our most important and favorite things come from plants.
Absolutely. And it really takes that diversity to make, the culinary diversity that we have, to really the diversity of flavors that we can have for our foods and whatnot. And we often think, as you said, those major crops, but there's so many minor crops around that really make life so much more rich. So you and I first met when you were a grad student studying mangoes, and we have that Anacardiaceae, which is the mango family, and connection. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your research on mangoes.
Yeah. So mangoes are as you can see in this picture, just a really amazing fruit because they have this wide variety of diversity in the fruit shape and color. And if you've had the opportunity to taste them, the flavor and the texture of these fruits varies widely. And so with my research, I was really interested in kind of understanding how mango changed as it was brought to different parts of the world. So mango was originally from India and domesticated there, but then it was introduced into new parts of the world throughout the last few thousand years. And I was really curious to see how these different parts of the world now have come to have such different types of mangoes.
And in your research, what did you find about sort of the wild mangoes that still exist in comparison to the many, many dozens of cultivars of mangoes that we have?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question. We know some about sort of wild species that are related to mangoes, but in terms of maybe the wild populations of the same species that mango is in, which is Mangifera indica, we don't actually have a good idea about where those individuals are and those populations are, if they still exist, because a lot of the parts of the world where they are thought to be from have experienced a lot of land use change over the past few, 100 years or so. And so we actually are hoping eventually to do some surveys to see if we can find some of these wild mango populations. But in general, what I found was that despite the fact that mango has sort of been transported into all of these new regions, really the major centers of diversity are still in India and then in Southeast Asia. So this region of Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam. So that was a pretty exciting finding, and that matches up with some of what we know. If you go to the grocery store, a lot of times you see these two different kinds of mangoes, sort of bigger red ones and smaller yellow ones, and those represent the Indian and the Southeast Asian sort of cultivar types.
That's super fascinating. One of the things that I've really enjoyed doing field work in South Asia is seeing some of the other mango species that are out there. And it struck me when I saw Mangifera minor, which has a very large fruit, why Mangifera indica was the one species of mango that was really selected by people thousands of years ago to cultivate and to make all of select all these cultivars that have larger and larger fruits or sweeter fruits or less fibrous and all of these different characters. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of why indica, or what are some of the kind of drivers and the features that are selected for mango for production?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think that's always an interesting thing to think about when we do think about what crops we have today. Why did we end up with these species and not other ones? In the case of mango, it's quite possible, India was an area where there was a lot of agriculture happening at a relatively early period in human history. And so this was a species, it's the only species of the genus that mango is in, so the only species that really produces a mango fruit in that area. So that's possibly part of why that particular species became so popular. But in Southeast Asia, there are these other species that are cultivated and consumed at a more local scale. So it's not something you'd find in the US, but if you travel there, you can experience some of these other Mangifera species that some of them are, just as delicious. And it's really fun to see that local diversity.
That's awesome. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the research that you did, not on mangoes, but totally switching systems, plants, types of growing, et cetera, the work that you did as a postdoc on sunflowers.
Yeah, so I, after working on mangoes for a little while, I was interested in thinking about, how can we learn more about mangoes, and what would be a good system for me to go learn from in terms of thinking about the importance of these wild relatives. And sunflower is a really great system to study. We have a lot of knowledge about sort of the genomes and the selection process that has happened during sunflower domestication. And we also have a really strong interest in wild sunflower species, which you can see in this slide are adapted to a wide variety of ecological habitats and conditions. So some species can tolerate flooding, others can, grow in sand dunes that look like nothing should be able to grow there. And other species can tolerate a lot of salt, living right on the shorelines of Texas. And so the main reason why these traits are so important is because in a lot of our cultivated species, including sunflower, we're trying to incorporate new diversity that will help our crops survive some of the challenges that we're already facing and expecting to face, in increasing frequency in the future. So higher temperatures, more sporadic precipitation, all of these conditions. And one of the ways you can do that is by, using these wild species and using them in breeding programs to introduce some of those traits into those species.
Can you speak a little bit about sort of mango cultivar selection? And, we think of, if we go to the grocery store in the United States, as you said, usually see two mangoes. I recently saw a third one, which I was very excited about, which was sort of a larger one that I'd only seen in China before, kind of a larger yellow, but like quite big. So we typically have two, though, that we see in the United States. And I think of those as like one being maybe a little sweeter, but more fibrous, and the other one being like almost no fiber, so smoother, but maybe a little more tangy than the other one. I'm wondering, we obviously select for flavor and texture, but what are some of the other characters that people might be selecting mangoes for? You talked about climate, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in mango, I think, obviously flavor and texture are a really big one. I always get people asking me for mangoes without the fibers in them and asking me to breed those. But I think some of the other things that we don't consider, because if you don't grow fruit crops, you might not realize a lot of fruit trees it's what's called alternate bearing. So they fruit maybe every other year. And so if you're a mango farmer, that's not really a desirable characteristic. So one of the things that people have been selecting for over time is just sort of consistent fruit production. There's also one thing that would be really great to have that we don't have yet in mango, which is a good dwarfing rootstock. And so you might know about this from apple trees, because they often you can get dwarf fruit trees in some circumstances, right? But grafting happens when you take the root system of one individual and the top or shoot of another individual, and you combine them. So they're two genetically distinct plants put into one plant. And if you find the right combination, you can have a root system that keeps the tree from growing really big. And when you're thinking about cultivating mango trees, they can grow to be really tall, like 100 feet tall, which makes it really difficult to pick those fruit. So oftentimes in orchards, they have to do a lot of heavy pruning to keep the trees small enough. So that would be a great trait that if we can find a dwarfing rootstock, that would be awesome.
Fantastic. We've got a question in the chat here. Why are mangoes not grown commercially in the United States?
That's a really good question. So technically they're grown in 2 to 3 parts of the U.S. at a somewhat commercial basis, in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And then South Florida does have mangoes that grow there like crazy. They're street trees in Miami. But the ones in South Florida don't last very long. They suffer from a fungal disease called anthracnose, which is really common in moist, humid areas. And so they don't have a great shelf life. The main reason why mangoes aren't grown commercially is just the climate isn't really optimal for them here. Mangoes can't tolerate freezing. And so there's not a lot of places in the US that don't have a freezing, or that have the right growing conditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that kind of speaks to the importance of the global food market, right? If we want to have this diversity on our plate, we really have to be trading fruits and vegetables and all kinds of other things across borders.
Yeah, and supporting the agriculture and development within those countries. So it's exciting to hear that you found a third kind of mango. And I was just recently, I was on a trip to Jamaica and doing some research about, their mango production, and discovered that they've recently begun to do some importing of mangoes into the US. So I think as time goes on, we'll see more and more mango varieties that are able to be imported into the US as they work through sort of the regulations that are required to do that process.
That is extremely exciting to me, I have to say. I love mangoes of all kinds, so that's awesome. Another question from the chat: what organism pollinates mangoes?
That's a great question. So from my understanding, the folks that I worked with in South Florida, they said the best pollinators they could find were actually kind of small flies. So you may have noticed in that first picture of the mango inflorescence in mango flowers are quite small. So they are maybe not efficiently pollinated by honeybees, unlike a lot of other fruits. So yeah, I think they used to tell me they'd put a can of tuna fish out by the mango trees to attract flies, and then the flies would also pollinate the trees. I don't know how true that is, but that was their technique.
That's incredible. Another question from the chat is: are all mangoes edible?
That's a good question. Yes. So all of the fruits from the species Mangifera indica are edible. And then of the wild species, there's about 70 species in the genus as a whole. And somewhere around 26 of those species are consumed. There may be other species that are edible, but just not very good.
I certainly sampled some of those not very good wild species.
Yes.
A bit tangy and tanniny, sort of.
Yeah.
So you've studied two really different crops in depth, one of which is an annual plant, sunflowers, and then, of course, the perennial woody mango. I'm wondering, just thinking about breeding of these and sort of the time scale on developing cultivars, if you could speak a little bit about the difficulties or challenges in developing woody cultivars, just generally.
Yeah, exactly. Woody species are long-lived, and so the breeding cycle for these crops is much longer. If you plant a woody species from seed, it'll take oftentimes at least 5 years before it starts flowering. And so unlike annual species where you might even be able to get, 2 generations within a year, these woody species, we just have to be very patient with them. However, the really nice thing about these woody crops is that we can do that process of grafting. So when we find an individual that we think is just exceptional, we just stop there and can conserve that individual as it is, and send little cuttings of that shoot around the world, so we can be growing Julie mango anywhere across the world. So it's difficult, but also just very different. And the other great thing is we can be looking at these rootstocks, as I was saying, and selecting them for particular traits. So we sort of can be doing selection on both the top, the fruit, and the root at the same time, and then combining those beneficial traits into one individual.
Yeah, I do love that. This is how we get things like the Honeycrisp apple, right? You get lots of 30 years of research, and finally you hit the jackpot, and you can trade that around as it is. Another question from the chat: this is like speaking right to my heart here. Can you please talk a bit about other members of the family Anacardiaceae? I believe it includes such plants as poison ivy, poison sumac, and cashew. Also pistachios I'll add in there. And then they had sort of a question about the toxicity of some of these plants. And maybe I'm wondering, kind of bringing that back to mango too, and to speak about a little bit about the toxicity of the overall plant.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, this is definitely your area of expertise, Susan. If you all might not be aware, Susan is an expert in the plant family Anacardiaceae. But yeah, it is the family that poison ivy and poison oak are in, along with cashew and pistachio and mango. So it's got a really crazy amount of diversity within this group. But yes, so mango, I often get people asking me, can you be allergic to mango? And yes, you can. Yes, I am. But it's usually just to the places where there's sap coming out of the plant. So if you pick a leaf and there's sap coming out, you might be allergic to that. Mango skin also will have these compounds in it that cause a similar reaction to a poison ivy rash. And the best way to avoid that is, don't eat the skin of mangoes. And once you're done cutting up a mango or eating a mango, just wash your hands and wash your face so you don't they call it mango mouth. But one of my favorite stories about, working with these wild mangifera species is when I was in Thailand and collecting some of these relatives of mango. And I got just a terrible rash from one of them, much worse than I had from, just a regular cultivated mango. And the next day, I was talking to my collaborator and he was translating for me, and he looked at me and he said, yeah, they call this one itchy mango. And so I was like, yeah, I can see why that is. I'm experiencing that.
That's fascinating. So just one species that was a little stronger with its compounds than the other ones. Interesting.
Yeah.
We've got a great question in the chat, but I'm going to pause that for a second to just kind of orient a little bit of another collaboration that you and I are involved in, and that is that you're part of a collaboration we have with Botanic Gardens Conservation International's U.S. office, where we are studying the wild relatives of fruit and nut trees that are native to the United States. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about kind of your role in that project and what we hope to learn from this research.
Yeah, this is a project I'm really excited about because, once I started working in mangoes, I realized I'm just fascinated by thinking about all of these domesticated fruit and nut trees. And then once you start looking around yourself here in the US, you realize there's a lot of relatives of these species, and even some of the species themselves. So pecan was domesticated here in the US. So we have wild pecans. We also have a couple of other really awesome native fruits, which I just think they're awesome. This American persimmon, which is a relative of the Asian persimmons that you might find in the store. And then pawpaw, which is a species that's kind of a strange outlier of a tropical group. So it has a really fun kind of tropical flavor for being something that's growing in the Midwest. But the goal of this project and my role in it is, we're working to facilitate collaborations between botanic gardens and researchers at universities and folks who run these collections of these plants at the USDA, trying to help them come together to really focus on understanding the diversity of these plants and conserving that diversity. Because a lot of these species are difficult to conserve. They really require, a lot of space because they're trees. They require a lot of management. Oftentimes, you can't just collect seeds and store the seeds. You have to grow them as plants to conserve the diversity. And so it requires more of a big group effort. So we're bringing together these groups, and my role is going to be to help make sure that we're conserving the genetic diversity of these and thinking about how to collect across the species range to get as much diversity as we can, but not burden ourselves by having too many individuals that we have to take care of as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm super excited about that project, and I think it's going to lead to really wonderful discoveries and some good conservation of some of the wild relatives of our crop plants. So one other question from the chat here, back to sunflowers. What pest chews stalks of sunflowers, and does putting foil around the stalk help?
That's a great question. This is not my area of expertise, right. I would say. So I am not sure. Putting foil around the stalk could help. I could see how that would be a physical barrier to something that's chewing them. But it's also possible the pest might just chew through it. So I would try to look up online to look for sunflower pests. And
and I see Grace has provided a plant hotline right there too, so everybody can take note of. We can answer horticulture questions here at the US Botanic Garden, and happy to do so if you email us. So we just have a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about what are you working on now that you're excited about? What are your sort of next steps? What's really getting you excited these days?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to come back to mango after having been in sunflower for a few years, and hoping to do some more trips to South and Southeast Asia to keep working on the diversity of these wild relatives. I also am really excited at the Missouri Botanical Garden. I'll have a few graduate students who are starting in the fall. So I'm excited to work with them and develop projects with them. One of the projects is hopefully going to be on the mangoes of Madagascar. And Madagascar just has this fascinating history of cultures and cultural diversity in terms of, where the people who settled in Madagascar came from. And so we're hoping to kind of understand how that cultural diversity and diversity in cuisine and uses of mango interacts with the genetic diversity of the fruits that they have there.
That sounds like an amazing project. I'm also excited for that project. Really, really wonderful. We just have 1 minute left. I'm wondering if you have any just parting, things to share with anybody.
Let's see. I don't know. I just hope that this has helped you all think a little more about the food that we eat, kind of how it's grown, how it got here, and appreciate the diversity of crops that we have, both in the grocery store and around the world, and maybe even in your own backyard.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to our future collaborations on mango and lots of other things. And just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emily Warschefsky and Dr. Susan Pell, for a wonderful discussion today. And thank you also to the Friends of the US Botanic Garden for supporting the Plant Science Conversation series.